Thorns and Shadows by S.R. Martin. Chapter 2. The four hunters made their way, following a winding game path, through the dense underbrush of the wood. The trees grew tall and chaotic, and they traveled through shifting twilight, even though it was only afternoon. They led an old goat onto a small clearing, where the surrounding trees stood so tall that no smaller trees could grow between them. As far as ambush locations, it was the best they had come across after following the Ungeheuer's trail for hours. They stopped in the middle of the clearing and looked around. The surrounding underbrush was thick, with only 3 large openings where game trails led. "I don't think we'll find a better spot," Carl, the young hunter, mused, leaning onto his long, heavy boar spear. Heinrich nodded in agreement. "I'm trapping the game trails. Don't step in them." Franz, the old trapper, grunted, took a swig from his hip flask, and headed for the edge of the clearing, chains jingling as he hefted his black iron bear traps. "I'll prep the goat," the huntress, who had introduced herself as Kirsten, exclaimed and drew her skinning knife. "You guys go ahead and hide." Carl nodded and took a step to the side, scanning the underbrush for a place to crawl under. Heinrich put a hand on his shoulder and pointed to the southwest. "Let's find somewhere downwind," he said. Carl grimaced and swallowed a curse, but eventually followed the older man's advice. A tortured bleating sounded from the goat as Kirsten forced it down on the ground and cut tendons on both of the animal's hind legs with 2 deft cuts. Heinrich paused for a moment to watch her, keeping an eye on her even as he joined Carl at the edge of the clearing, where he rammed his spear with the iron-pointed butt into the ground and began removing the wax-cloth sack covering the tip, the barrel of a wheel-lock blunderbuss. Wire ran through a thin tube halfway down the shaft, where the hunter could pull on a brass ring to fire the weapon. Carl watched as Heinrich rummaged through his ammunition pouch, pulled forth a paper cartridge, and began loading the weapon. "I've seen hunters use arquebuses with long bayonets before, but never a weapon such as this," the young hunter remarked as Heinrich tore the tip of the paper to open the cartridge. He spat out the paper and replied, pouring the powder down the barrel of the gun. "It's something the old crackpot from the workshop wanted me to try out. Too unwieldy if you ask me, but it's got quite the punch," he explained. Carl nodded. "Might be the punch we need to bring down this Ungeheuer," he mused. Heinrich pulled the ramrod from his belt, rammed it down the barrel to compact the powder with practiced strokes, then held it in his teeth as he used his skinning knife to open the other end of the cartridge, poured its content down the barrel, careful not to touch them. "That's not buckshot. What is it?" Carl asked as Heinrich used the ramrod again. "Dragon shot. Iron filings and some mad alchemy," he explained, then took a fat and wax-drenched piece of cloth from his ammo pouch and rammed it in last to seal the load in the barrel. "It's a nasty combination, even burns underwater," he explained as he used a key to wind the firing mechanism of the wheel-lock gun. "Oh, you mean that crackpot from the workshop?" Carl exclaimed. "Old Schwartz, the one without eyebrows." Heinrich nodded. "That's the one." He pulled the spear from the ground and primed the firing pan with a measured dose of powder from a small horn. Carl raised an eyebrow when Heinrich pulled the wax cloth back over the tip of his weapon once again. "Don't you want to use the gun?" he asked. "This way, you can use it in the rain," Heinrich explained, walking past him toward the edge of the clearing. "Let's make sure we are well hidden," he said, and began swiping leaves to the side with the butt of his weapon. Kirsten came to join them. She took off her rucksack, pulled out a recurve bow, pinned it behind her left knee to bend it, and strung it with ease. Heinrich wrinkled his brow as he saw her testing the bow, drawing it to her shoulder and back. Her compact frame did not betray the apparent strength of her arms. Satisfied, she pulled out a length of rope from her pack and handed the later to Carl. "I'll be in the trees," she said. "Hide this for me." With that, she vanished in the underbrush, and a moment later the two men heard the rustling of leaves overhead, while the huntress secured herself in her shooting position with the rope. "She knows her way around the woods," Heinrich mused as he and Karl lay down, reading backwards into their hiding spots. The young hunter nodded. "Yeah, huntress born and raised in the wood. Knows the forest like the back of her hand." Karl nodded and grimaced as he watched Franz wave to them and vanish into his hiding spot 10 paces to their left. The trapper, with his spirit-clouded eyes, might have mistaken the tracks of the Ungeheuer for those of a bear. And Karl might not have the experience, but would the wood-born Kirsten make the same mistake? The 4 hunters settled in for a long wait, rolling themselves tighter into the wool coats and cloaks as the goat bleated pitifully and the sun crawled behind the horizon. As night fell, it started to rain, and the hunters readied tubes of alchemical blue light so they could light them quickly, holding them close at hand, but left them sealed in their wax paper tubes. Heinrich slowly shifted in his position, trying to keep the blood running in his legs without making too much noise. At least the drizzling rain would work to hide their noise and smell from the Ungeheuer. He took a glance at the young hunter hidden a few steps to his right, but even knowing where he was, he could barely make out the man's eyes in the pitch darkness under the thick forest canopy. He had to admit, his opinion of Karl had changed since he first saw him in the hamlet. Young, inexperienced, and brash, maybe, but he turned out to be actually eager to bring the Ungeheuer down, helping with the planning, tracking, and laying in ambush all day without complaint. The other two, less so. Franz was probably asleep after taking a hefty swig from his hip flask. Heinrich could understand why, even if it didn't improve his opinion of the man. Traveling and hunting in the wood left scars on a man, both body and soul, and alcohol dulled the pain, at least for a time. Heinrich knew, all too well, but he also knew not to imbibe on a hunt. It dulled not only the pain, but also the senses, and slowed the hands. The young huntress Kirsten, on the other hand, gave him a gut-wrenching feeling of unease. Heinrich did not know how long they waited in the cold, wet darkness. Without sun, moon, or stars, it was impossible to tell the time, but for the growing tiredness and discomfort of one's body. He would not call off this ambush before sunrise, but he caught himself wishing that moment would come soon. He needed to take a piss, didn't want to soil his pants. The Ungeheuer came sooner. Sudden rustling of leaves, snapping of twigs, then crushing of bones, and the cries of an old man. "Franz!" Karl shouted. He and Heinrich jumped from their hiding hole. They trained their spears to where they knew the trapper to be hiding. More cries, the sound of tearing sinew and breaking bones, crack of a crossbow, and a dull thud as the bolt impacted on wood. Something huge was moving between the trees. It made no sound. Karl lunged, sliding his heavy spear forward in his grip to increase his reach, and thrust blindly at the creature. He grunted with effort. There was a dull thud as the blade hit something. Heinrich rested his spear in the crook of his arm and tore open the wax paper of the blue light with cold, dulled hands. He fumbled for a moment, then finally managed to pull the ignition head over the sandpaper. With a sudden flash and hiss, a blazing bright light ignited, and he threw it in a high arc towards the Ungeheuer. He immediately grabbed his spear to follow the light with an attack. The glaring flare illuminated the Ungeheuer as the light arced towards it. The creature was big and stout as a bear, but instead of a pelt, it had a hide of branches, brambles, and thorns. Slick with rain, the plants seemed to cover all the body. It was not outright made of plants. With 4 tree-trunk-like limbs, it tore and stomped on Franz, grinding the old hunter into a bloody pulp. Karl stared at the creature with wide eyes. Heinrich dashed past him, lunging at the beast, ramming his spear at the bulbous shape where the head should be. But the Ungeheuer was fast. Twisted, turned, and he only hit its shoulder. The white man put his weight into the thrust with a snarl and felt a hard resistance, as if hitting wood, before the tip of his weapon punched through the Ungeheuer's hide and sunk into the soft flesh beneath. Heinrich reached for the ring to pull the blunderbuss firing mechanism, but before he could, the creature wheeled about, yanking hard on the spear. Heinrich was pulled along and had to let go of the weapon, lest he would be yanked off his feet. A snapping sound came from above. Curses, and Nero fell useless to the ground. "Stop it!" Heinrich yelled at the young hunter, tearing his white man's knife from its sheath. Karl blinked, confused, but then shouted a battle cry and lunged for the Ungeheuer again, stabbing his spear at it with desperate strength. But the creature jumped away from them, crashing through the thick underbush, and Karl stepped only thin air where it had just been. Heinrich picked up the blue light, and they rushed after the beast, but was already gone from the clearing. After a few heartbeats, even the crashing, breaking, and snapping of twigs stopped, and the forest fell silent again, but for the constant drizzling of the rain. The two men stood panting in the light of the torch that quickly burned through its alchemical fuel. Heinrich hurried to pick up his spear 5 paces into the wood, and crouched down to look at the tracks. "What the fuck just happened?" Karl cursed, stopping beside him. "That damn Ungeheuer is cleverer than we thought," Heinrich replied with a bitter frown. "What now, great expert?" Kirsten snarled as she jumped from the lowest branches of the tree she had been hiding in. Heinrich rammed his spear into the ground butt first, and covered the distance to the huntress with long strides. Before the sneer faded from her lips, he had grabbed her by the collar and pulled her face closer to his. "Now, you'll tell me what happened to your bow," he growled. Her hand was on the grip of her long knife, but he had the blade of his knife against her wrist before she could pull it free. "String got wet and snapped on me," Kirsten replied nonchalantly. Karl was between them and pushed them apart before Heinrich could inquire further. "Get off her!" he yelled. "It's not her fault." He looked at the woman, then at Heinrich. "Weather is bad. Equipment breaks all of the time. Shit happens," he explained desperately. "But Franz is dead, and if we fight among us, this hunt is finished, and his death will be in vain." Heinrich gave him and Kirsten a long, deadpan stare, as the light from the torch sputtered and died, plunging them into darkness. He let go of the woman and sheathed his knife, spitting on the ground. He hurried to pick up his spear, then pulled a storm lantern from his pack and lit it, shielding it with his cloak from the rain as he struck 3 matches at once. "Hurry and grab your things. We have to get back to the hamlet," he said. Karl just stared at him for a moment. "What? If we don't follow the tracks right now, we will lose the Ungeheuer." Heinrich just grunted in reply. "But we can't end the hunt here. Franz is dead because of that thing," Karl protested. Heinrich glanced over to where the old trapper had been smeared into red mud, then shook his head, put a heavy hand on the young hunter's shoulder. "We are not ending the hunt," he said in a grave voice, a somber look in his eyes. "But we just became the hunted." Chapter 3. "Your plan got Franz killed. Experienced hunter my arse," Kirsten complained between clenched teeth, not for the first time. "It's your fault we are in this mess." "Save your breath and walk faster," Heinrich growled. "You can blame me all you want once we are back in the hamlet, but we are not out of the woods yet." He quickened his steps along the game trail, winding through the forest thicket. It had been easy enough to follow the Ungeheuer's trail at day, too easy in hindsight. But now, at night, with rain, they could barely see 2 steps ahead of them, with the flickering lights of their storm lanterns. In the morning, the four of them had also agreed that it was a good plan. And as far as Heinrich remembered, the original idea had been from Franz. Thankfully, Karl did not join his lover's tirade of complaints, and instead watched the shadows between the trees with wild intent. The encounter with the Ungeheuer had him rattled still. The situation was bad enough without the huntress stirring up the scent. They had been running from the Ungeheuer for hours. Now they were wet, sore, tired, and both the hamlet and sunrise were still a few hours away. Duck, Heinrich warned and crouched beneath low branches. He was leading the party, with Kirsten in the middle and Karl bringing up the rear. The huntress was reduced to just a long knife. She had not brought any waxed horse or bowstrings to be able to shoot in the rain. The old hunter glanced to the tip of his own spear. The blade protruded from the waxed cloth bag where it had stepped through the fabric into the creature. It was also crooked. He had to bend it back into shape after it was torn out of the wound. He hoped the damaged blade was still good for another attack, and that the powder and the gun was still dry. There was no time to check. Heinrich came out of the thicket and could finally stand back up straight. He stopped for a moment, arcing his aching back, and waited for the others to catch up, when he suddenly heard a crashing of branches from behind. The Ungeheuer struck once again. But the old hunter felt the warmth of a body in his back. He wheeled around, dropping his lamp, swiping the air with his spear shaft. The blade of a long knife clanked against the wood of his spear, deflecting what had been a deadly thrust to his back. The lamp fell to the ground, the glass shattering, spilling oil over the forest floor, which quickly ignited into a bright flash fire. Kirsten was inside Heinrich's guard. She sidestepped the spear and brought the knife back up in a two-handed thrust. With the reflexes of a cornered wolf, Heinrich's left hand struck out at the weapon. The blade pierced the palm of his hand, sliding all the way to the crossguard. Then he pushed against Kirsten's hand and deflected the thrust to the side, his hand wrapping around her fingers. Heinrich dropped his spear and tore his own knife from its sheath, slashing upwards in the same motion. Kirsten jumped back, tearing her knife out of Heinrich's hand, but was off balance from her own attack and too slow to get away. The razor-sharp blade of Heinrich's hunter's knife sliced across her belly and chest in a bloody arc. She fell back, stumbled over a root, fell, but rolled over her shoulder and back onto her feet in a low crouching guard, pressing her left hand against her belly, raising her bloody knife high. Heinrich raised his knife, the rain already washing the blood from the blade. He noticed he was holding something in his left hand, slick with his own blood. It was Kirsten's leather mitten. His eyes fell on her naked left hand. "So you were one of hers all along?" he growled, and threw the glove onto the ground. Kirsten lifted her exposed hand, red with blood. Her middle and ring finger were grown together into one crippled limb, silvery thread shining where the fingers had been sewn together. She sneered at Heinrich, pressed the hand back onto the wound, where her clothes quickly turned crimson. The wound looked painful, if not deep enough to be fatal. "The Lady of the Woods wishes the hamlet gone," Kirsten said, took another step backwards. Battle cries, the sound of breaking wood sounded from the other side of the thicket, a call for the Ungeheuer alone. At least he was still fighting. "Tell your lady," Heinrich spat between clenched teeth, "that she can't have it, while even a single white man still stands," he said, trying to put more bravado into his words than he was feeling. A cry of pain sounded from the other side, followed by more snapping and crushing. "So not long at all," Kirsten replied with an evil grin, took another step back, vanishing into the shadow of the woods. Heinrich wanted to pursue her, put an end to the backstabbing traitor, but he could not leave Karl to his fate. He snapped up his spear from the ground and hurried back through the thicket, branches snapping into his face, thorns tearing at his clothes and skin. Within a few heartbeats he was through the thicket, The ground had been plowed by a brutal fight. Carl's lantern too had been shattered, and a burning tree illuminated his desperate struggle. His leathers were torn, he was bleeding from a score of wounds, and his right arm hung limp at his side. But still he held his heavy spear in one hand and stabbed at the bolt where the creature's face should be, barely keeping it at a distance. Heinrich brought his spear up and rushed in, striking from the shadows like a lynx without making a sound. His thrust pierced the creature's hide, and he kept pushing, ripping the weapon to the side with a grunt of effort. The spear blade snapped off, but not before tearing a fist-sized hole into the hide. The creature tried to turn and dodge to the side, but Carl seized the opportunity to strike and stabbed at the left foreleg, his spear piercing through the joint and out of the other side with a wet, sickening crunch, until the wings behind the blade stopped the thrust. The Ungeheuer stumbled, its leg giving way. "Light it up!" Carl cried as he pushed with all his weight onto the spear, pinning the creature down to the ground. Heinrich aimed the broken spear to where he had struck before, grabbed the ring of the firing mechanism with his wounded hand, and clenched his teeth against the pain as he pulled on the wire. Hidden by the wax cloth, the trigger released the wheel, and it spun, striking sparks from the flint, igniting the black powder still left in the priming pan. The back was blown off the weapon as it spat fire and brimstone at the Ungeheuer with a deafening roar. The recoil ripped the spear from Heinrich's blood-slick hands, and he stumbled backwards, clutching for his knife. But his aim had been true, and the alchemical fire struck into the already opened wound. Smoke and sparks belched from the hole, and the bramble-like hide of the creature started to blacken and burn around it. The creature still made no sound, but it bucked and twisted, trying in vain to get away from the pain. Carl cried out, holding on to his spear with the last of his strength. "Finish it!" he gasped. Heinrich stopped going for his knife and instead fumbled a clay bottle from his belt, uncorked it with his teeth, and threw it firmly at the center of the struggling creature, where the alchemical fire still burned. The bottle thumped against the creature's wooden hide, spilling its contents over it, a mixture of tar, lamp oil, and strong spirits the hunters had cooked up in the hamlet. It quickly caught flame, and a carpet of fire spread over the Ungeheuer. Carl recoiled from the heat, letting go of his spear. The creature stumbled to its feet, then rolled over the ground, but the flames stuck to it even as it moved. It took 3 more steps before it collapsed and burned down like so much firewood.